Hey, how's it going? Welcome to week 12 of my D&D diary. This week in my Deltora Quest campaign, my players had just been to the Hero Plains and they'd been attacked by like a mass of rats. So they ended up retreating back onto their boat and just going adrift into Broad River. They let the current wash them downstream for a bit and they use a sword tied to a bit of rope to anchor the boat, and they spend the night sleeping in the boat. In the morning, they continue drifting along the river until they notice an Akbaba flying overhead. An Akbaba is one of the Shadow Lord's minions. They're like these large, deformed birds of prey, and they have these spikes running along their spine, and they have teeth inside their beak, and they're just killing machines. There are 7 Akbaba in existence in Deltora, and they scour the countryside, and then they report back to the Shadow Lord. The 7 Akbaba have been terrorizing Deltora's countryside for over 1,000 years, and one is flying above the party right now. So my players understand that an Akbaba is a high-level threat, so they decide to hide. One of the players, Taark, decides to jump overboard and hide under the water, while the other players decide to huddle up underneath the invisibility cloak. The Akbaba spots the boat and comes down to inspect it, and I get my players to roll stealth rolls, and they succeed. But the Akbaba starts picking through their stuff. After a while, the monk decides, screw this, I'm going to jump out and attack it. He jumps out from under the cloak and attacks the Akbaba. Meanwhile, Taark is underwater, and some wise fish come over him and shield him from view from the Akbaba. At this point, the Akbaba goes into full attack mode. But for its 3 attacks, I roll 2 misses and 1 critical fail, so it plunges into the side of the boat, tearing a hole in it, instead of tearing a hole in the monk. So the cleric decides to come out from underneath the cloak as well and start wailing on the Akbaba. The Akbaba attacks the monk and does a bunch of damage, so the monk jumps overboard and tries to escape under the water. The Akbaba turns its attention to the cleric and drops the cleric. The rogue, realizing that the cleric might die here, crawls out from underneath the cloak and attempts to give the cleric a medicine check. Meanwhile, Taark decides to come up and help fight the Akbaba, but the wise fish block him from coming up, so he slashes one of the fish and pushes his way to the surface. Taark comes out of the water and helps the rogue and begins to fight the Akbaba. The Akbaba turns to Taark and cuts into him. Taark goes unconscious. The rogue is now one-on-one with the Akbaba, but he has a plan. He goes and he grabs some water eaters and he holds a handful of the beads, right? And he waits until the Akbaba attacks him. As soon as the Akbaba attacks, he releases his held action of throwing some water eaters into its mouth and succeeds. And so the water beaters go straight into the beak of the Akbaba as the Akbaba attacks. But when the Akbaba does attack, it attacks once with the beak and once with each of its talons. And with the second talon attack, I deal massive damage to the rogue. So I get my player to roll a constitution save, and she gets a 3. And a 3 equals a massive upper body wound, which in this case is Milton, the rogue, getting his arm ripped clean off. But then the Akbaba starts to feel strange as all the water in his insides starts being absorbed. It begins to fly away, but the water eaters are already starting to expand inside of it. So it tries to fly away, but all of the water in its blood is getting sucked out and it explodes into chunks as part of it careens off towards the hero plane, and then feathers and muck fall everywhere. Now, the only one left alive is the monk, and he comes back onto the boat and he attempts to do a medicine check on Taark, but he fails, and Taark fails all his saving throws, and Taark dies. Milton, on the other hand, is successful with her saving throws and manages to survive. They take the boat in to the shore once they pass the hero plane, and they give Taark like a Viking burial. I killed one of my players' characters, and I've actually never done that before. The player whose character lost an arm, she's not very happy at all that she's lost an arm, and her new goal for her character is to find an arm at all costs. But yeah, that was my Deltora Quest campaign. In the Tomb of Annihilation campaign, my players, Torb and Ajan, have left Curse of Strahd and they're headed towards Nangalore to check out what's in Nangalore. Most of this session was just jungle exploration and random encounters and that type of thing. They ran into a Plesiosaurus, which they then murdered and gained XP. After a while, they were plagued by some heavy rains. I have a system that I'm actually kind of proud of, I'll show you. I believe there is a system in the module for determining what rain is going to happen. I came up with my own system that I like a lot. I don't know if you can see that there. I have tropical, heavy, rain, and clear. And so if I roll a 1, it's going to be a tropical storm that day. If I roll a 2 to a 4, it's going to be heavy rain that day. And if I roll a 5 to a 9, it's just going to be raining like regular. It rains every day in Chult, basically. And then if I roll a 10 to a 12, it's clear. I change the die that I roll depending on the weather of that day. If it's a tropical storm, I roll a d6. If it's heavy rain, I roll a d8. If it's just raining in general, I roll a d10. And if it's clear, I roll a d12. And so most days it rains. But if it's clear, it's got a 1 in 4 chance of continuing to be clear, and a tropical storm could happen at any time. So those are the things that I kind of needed to make sure. They're traveling through the jungle and a tropical storm sets upon them. So they quickly find a cave and they go into it, and they're attacked by the spiders that live in that cave. And they manage to fend off all the spiders, and they wait in the cave overnight. They also utilize the folding boat on the Oolong River as its small version, being able to navigate through waterways and such. And that helps them get to Nangalore. They forayed a bit into Nangalore, but they haven't run into anything yet. We ended the session just before they got to a major encounter. But that was Tomb of Annihilation this week. Oh boy. In the Curse of Strahd campaign. Gee boy. Oh no. This week was a bit of a doozy. So, it starts off, we're having the typical Sex in the City, we've made it to Valicai, we're gonna go for a bit of a shop, right? So, the paladin's down and he's like fixing a roof, and the bard, I'm pretty sure he's a changeling, because he's taken a different form. He's taken Orn instead of Ivern. So, when we met him, he was Ivern, but now he's Orn. He's gone and he's smithing. He's actually making me and the paladin some silvered weapons, but it's going to take him 5 days. I went to Blinksey's store and looked around Blinksey's. The barbarian went to the Lady Watcher's house, but no one knows about that. And the warlock and the wizard, they went to see if they could get healed, because one of them was haunted by a hag, and the other one is feeling exhausted after poisoning me and himself with cackling fever. So the warlock and the wizard make it to the church, and there they meet the priest. I can't remember his name, but he was really cool. Basically the priest, just a super duper top bloke, right? He tells the wizard and the warlock, oh yeah, there's some sacred bones hidden under the church, the bones of Saint Andril, and they keep Strahd from coming in. But then he mentions the bones have recently been stolen, and he's wondering if he could, if the party could look around and maybe get them back. In one of the card readings that we got was bones of an ancient enemy, and that was something that's supposed to be able to help us. So we thought, perfect. Bones of an ancient enemy, the bones of Saint Andril. We need to get these bones because they're going to help us to defeat Strahd. So the wizard and the warlock, they interrogate some boys, and they find out the bones are most likely at Hendrik, the coffin maker's house. So the wizard and the warlock, they come back to the tavern. We all meet back at the tavern. After Orn, the bard, has done his work, after Jar-Hazar, the paladin, has done his work, after I came back from Blinksey's, after everyone gets back, we go off to the coffin maker's house. One thing I'll note, but I won't touch on in this diary, is the barbarian has a bandage covering his eye. And that's all I'll describe, because things are happening that my character doesn't know, and I kind of want to tell you about them when my character learns about them. So we make it to the coffin maker's house, and we meet Hendrik. And we took Irina with us, and she uses her status as a noble to help us get into the house. He's like, oh no, we're closed. But Irina's like, we really need, our friend just died. And it's true, because Azir, the lizard folk, died like 3 sessions ago. We didn't keep his body because it ran off, but we weren't lying about having a friend that recently died. And so the warlock thinks it's a great idea, and it was. Admittedly, it was a great idea. He casts suggestion on Hendrik and says, hey, you should go for a walk around town for the next, 8 hours and not come back. And Hendrik was like, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And everyone in the party immediately starts poking around in different rooms, right? Notably, the paladin goes upstairs. He's like shuffling through some crates. He's looking at some barrels when he stumbles upon one barrel that's seemingly innocuous. I don't know if it's a barrel, maybe it's like part of a coffin or something, but he does something and 6 vampires pop out. And it's like, they just pop out of nowhere, right? And then we go into initiative. We should have died right there, but the vampires had a different agenda. 6 of them immediately jump out the windows and start rampaging through the town. In a different room, the wizard is looking through some papers or whatever, and 2 vampires jump out. One of them grabs a bag of bones and starts running towards the door. The wizard casts hold person on the vampire with the bones, but it fails. He misty steps after them, tries to grapple them, but it slips through, and that's it. The vampires are so much faster than us. They have 50 feet of movement, and even with dash as a bonus action, I can only go 90 feet per round. The vampires ravage the town. Strahd's influence hasn't been in Valicai for over 100 years, and now half the town is dead, right? And the vampires, while they're ravaging the town and whatnot, they're also heading west. So we follow in the wake of the destruction as fast as we can. We make it to the church, and once we're inside and we have a chance to check ourselves, we look up, and who do we see? It's Strahd, and he's there, and he's holding the preacher, like the super nice dude that we just met. He's holding him by the neck, and then he like crushes his head and pulls out his spine through his body, and blood is spurting out everywhere. And the DM's just like getting really into it, like super graphic. He's like blub 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 blub. It's like the blood comes out of the aorta, spurting up everywhere. It was intense, right? And then Strahd like turns like his gaze to us and is like, what are you doing, like messing with my spawn? So Strahd puts one hand on the bones and destroys them. None of us are brave enough to do anything to stop it. After things have settled, the paladin is like, Strahd, you're a tyrant and we're gonna put an end to you, as the paladin would. And Strahd like sends 2 black spikes up from the floor and impales the paladin, dropping him to 0 and coming like a hair's breadth away from killing him outright. So Strahd and the vampires leave the temple, and I go over and I collect like the bag of ash. So we head back to the inn. Half the town was murdered. We're walking through the streets and there's just blood and people are splattered everywhere, and it's not a good time. We make it to the inn, and the inn people let us in for whatever reason, but they make sure to check us of any bite marks. The warlock manages to pull off like a quick spell and conceals Irina's bite marks as she walks into the inn. That's basically where we ended that session. That was a heavy session, dude. It started out, we were having a good time, and then it just got depressing really quick. But then again, we're all not dead, which, faced with 8 vampires, we probably should have been. I also, this week, did a session 0 for a campaign that I'm going to be starting in like a month's time. We don't have too much figured out. I have made a map of like the larger world, and I'm still like coming up with things and places, but in the session 0, we came up with each of the characters and their motivations and where they fit into the campaign world. My players are a tiefling mystic who works for Keldor but is stationed in Thypra. His job is a spy. Keldor is at war with Abram. His job is to monitor whether or not Thypra is a threat. He's taken the Wu Gen discipline of Mastery of Force, and he's also chosen Nomadic Arrow, and he hasn't chose his third one yet, but he's thinking of taking the Wu Gen Mystic. He wants to be able to throw daggers and move them around with telekinesis. He also wants to be able to push and pull enemies and allies to help them to get out of danger, or maybe push them off a cliff. One of my other players is playing a half-elf warlock who has found a patron in his dreams. I'm not sure what he's going with yet, but it seems as if his patron is either him from the future or him from a different life, but basically he wants power so that he can save his father. And I'm not sure if his father's sick yet, but it's either his father's sick or his father's a human and he's going to outlive him by a bit because he's a half-elf. And this patron is going to make him perform feats of heroism to prove himself worthy of gaining the power of saving his father. And my last player is going to play a wood elf monk. He's been living peacefully in one of the forests to the west of Thypra. But as the Fae increase their influence on the world, so does the Shadowfell. And the Shadowfell is slowly starting to claim territory from his forest. Seeing that this could potentially become a cataclysm, he's headed to Thypra to seek counsel, to see whatever he can do, he will do to try and stop the rise of the Shadowfell taking over his homeland. And that's what I have at the moment. I have some ideas for Thypra, but I'll expand on them over the next month, and then I'll let you know when we do that session. But yeah, that was this week. Have a good day.